Welcome back. In today's video, taking a look at the state of Florida and their governor's race between Democrat Andrew Gillum and Republican Ron DeSantis, and my prediction on how I see this one playing out going towards the midterms in November. So going to take a look at the primary results, look at some historical data back at the 2014 and 2010 governor's races, and then also polling data between Gillum and DeSantis that we've been getting in recent weeks. So after I go through all of that, going to wrap things up and give my final prediction. But starting off here, before I do a deep dive into the data, just want to talk about these two candidates. We have Gillum and DeSantis, basically a proxy battle of what we could get in 2020 between Sanders and Trump, because Gillum aligning himself with Bernie Sanders, Sanders coming down and stumping with Gillum, a very progressive candidate, and then DeSantis lining up with Trump in the Republican Party, full support behind the Republican president. So a proxy battle here, and a very important data point, because the state of Florida, arguably the most important state to win in a presidential election. So if the progressives do really well here, it gives them a piece of information that they can use and say, we've proven that you win a statewide election in Florida with progressive politics, not status quo or establishment moderate Democratic candidates. And also, just talking about these two respective primaries, on the Republican side, DeSantis, he was polling ahead of Putnam, but not by a significant, massive margin, maybe around 10 percentage points or so. On election day, he goes on and wins by 20 percentage points. And that just goes to show you, in those polls where they take a track of likely voters, there's a lot of Trump-style voters in the Republican side that aren't in that likely voter camp necessarily. So those people showing up and voting for DeSantis, allowing him to go on and win this one by a considerable margin, a 20 percentage point gap there between him and Putnam. And you have kind of a similar thing going on in the Democrat side, where Gillum, he didn't poll well at all through running up to that primary. He was in a distant third or fourth place, usually around 10 percentage points or so in the polls. On election day, vastly outperforming any expectations, getting over 34% of the vote. So another situation where a lot of people that aren't likely voters coming out and supporting the progressive candidate in Gillum. And then also another interesting piece of data in that primary, Gillum outspent by a ridiculous margin. He, at least the numbers I saw, they put in like $6 million in comparison to Graham and Levine, who were more in the $30 to $40 million range. So it just goes to show you, it's not all about money. When you have grassroots support behind your candidacy, that can overcome money interest, and that's what Gillum was able to do with all of those progressive groups behind him, as well as Bernie Sanders, for instance, coming and helping his candidacy and pushing Gillum over the line. So going over that, now I want to get into the data. So on the Democrat side, over 1.5 million votes. On the Republican side, over 1.6 million votes. A great turnout for both parties, especially once we look back at recent historical data. In the midterms, you'll see the vast difference in the primary voting numbers. But another thing that I want to mention, a lot of my videos, I say this, if the Democrats can keep things competitive in a primary, that's generally a good sign for them, because your typical Democratic voter compared to your typical Republican voter is not going to have quite as good turnout in the primaries as compared to the general election. And we'll also see that as we go back towards this recent historical data. So going back to 2014, Rick Scott, the incumbent, taking down Charlie Crist, only about a 64,000 vote gap between the two, just a 1 percentage point difference. So you can see, again, remember this number, about a 65,000 vote gap there. And then also the 2010 election, where it was Rick Scott versus Alex Sink, very close, within 1.2 percentage points. And the final vote total was about a 70 to 80,000 vote gap between the two candidates. And we compare that back to the primary results. The vote total on the Democrat side was a little over 830,000. And then the Republicans, with the incumbent, were at about 950,000, so about 120,000 vote difference. And then on election day, it was about a little over a 60,000 vote difference. So they were, the Democrats, able to close the gap there, but not enough to overcome the Republicans. And then going back to 2010, bigger stark contrast there, where in the primaries, the Democrats, they got about 860,000 votes, in comparison to the Republicans, who got over 1.2 million votes. So about 400,000 vote difference there in the positive for the Republicans. So the Democrats were able to close that 400,000 plus vote gap down to about 70 to 80,000 on Election Day. So in each instance, the Democrats were able to close the gap, but not by enough to overcome the Republicans in what were very close races in the state of Florida. And again, great turnout. As you can see, a big boost on both sides, particularly the Democrats. This is almost double the turnout of what they had in 2014 and 2010. And then the Republicans also getting a nice boost for themselves in these primaries as well. So just another thing that I actually want to touch on about Andrew Gillum in particular before I get into the polling data. The Republican strategists, they did not want Gillum to win. And the fact that they were able to figure this out and the Democratic strategists can't see this just blows my mind. But the Republicans, the reason they didn't want Gillum to win is because they know that he would turn out unlikely voters, and that's going to have a trickle-down effect, not just obviously in the governor's race, but any Democrat that's on the ticket in a competitive House race. Bill Nelson running for re-election, the incumbent senator, against Rick Scott, who's going to be trying to take that Senate seat. That can have a trickle-down positive effect. So I have to tip my cap to these Republican strategists that they could see something that these Democratic strategists still haven't been able to figure out. The Democrats and the establishment putting their weight behind the candidates that weren't Gillum in this particular primary, while the progressives were supporting Gillum and trying to prove their thesis that you need to put a candidate on the ballot that encourages turnout. It's not about picking the safest candidate or the moderate status quo candidate. You want a candidate that inspires people to come out and vote, has an affirmative message to get that turnout. And if we just go back in recent history, looking at the state of Florida in presidential elections, Hillary Clinton, what the Democrats felt was a very safe candidate. She didn't inspire that turnout. She ended up losing the state of Florida to Donald Trump. But then you had Obama in 2012 and 2008 who inspired that enthusiasm and turnout. And as a result, the Democrats were able to win Florida in 2012 and 2008, respectively. So we'll see how that plays out in this race as well. Okay, so now going to the polling data, and initially very close. Gillum, the first couple of polls that came out, he was up by 2 points in Gravis and 3 points in Quinnipiac. And then about a week or two after that, he was up 4 points in Survey USA and 6 points from Rasmussen. So he is able to gain a little bit here. And I think that this increase in polling results for Gillum has to do with some of the controversies that have surrounded DeSantis in terms of his racist remarks and also his actions on Facebook that were linked to not the greatest group or people that you want to be aligning yourself with. I think that has had a negative result. When you're taking a look at independent voters that are trying to make a decision between Gillum and DeSantis, when you have those types of negative dark clouds hovering over your candidacy, it's going to negatively affect you more often than not. And we are seeing that happen a little bit in the polling numbers getting better for Gillum. And another big positive to take out of this for Gillum is the fact that he so vastly overperformed his polling data going into the primaries. If I was a Democrat and I would just see Gillum at about an even with DeSantis, a lot of these unlikely voters are probably going to push him over the line at the end of the day. But also DeSantis, to be fair, he also overperformed what the polls were saying that he was going to do in his primary as well. But Gillum definitely more so in overperforming that particular data. So the fact that he's already ahead in the polls and the fact that the polls were wrong in the negative more so for Gillum than DeSantis, I think that's another big positive for the Democrats in Gillum in this one. So at the end of the day, my prediction, probably not a big surprise, based on all the data that we've gone over in this video, I am siding with the Democrats and Andrew Gillum, the candidate that the Republican strategists were most worried about. I agree with their sentiment that Gillum is a very dangerous threat to taking over this governor seat from the Republicans in their eyes. And that's how I see this one playing out. So Gillum winning this one. And my prediction is having him probably around about a 5-point margin is what I'm going to place it at as his margin of victory. So thanks guys for stopping on in. For more prediction and analysis videos, click that subscribe button. Hope to see you back here for future videos.